Grand Canyon in the American state of Arizona is over 200 miles long and up to 1 mile deep. It is one of the natural wonders of the world. Given its size, it's always been difficult for the tourist to take everything in. Yet nowadays, he or she can do so from the air. The hot air balloon is also a wonderful way of viewing the world about us. Nowhere is this more so than in the game parks of East Africa. Here the balloon has advantages over the aircraft in that it provides virtually uninterrupted vision and is comparatively noise-free. Certainly, a safari holiday like this can be the experience of a lifetime. Aviation also enables us to identify features that are not obvious at ground level. No better example of this exists than in Peru. For here are found the mysterious Nazca lines, named after the Nazca civilization which thrived a millennium ago. The markings include birds and animals. Yet on the ground, many of the lines are barely discernible, apart from some which run dead straight for literally miles. No one knows for certain what their purpose was. Some experts say that they were an elaborate astronomical clock, while others argue that their significance was purely religious. But whatever their origin, they are a source of endless fascination, which can only be properly appreciated from the air. But until the arrival of the aircraft, our knowledge of many of the more inaccessible regions of the globe remained only sketchy. In 1913, ex-President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, led an expedition to explore one of the major tributaries of the world's longest river, the Amazon. Using dugout canoes, Roosevelt and his team traced the as yet uncharted river from its source. They faced incredible hardship, and 2 of the expedition members were killed. The greatest problem that Roosevelt's party faced was never knowing what lay around the next bend of the river. Often they would suddenly come across dangerous rapids. These forced them to make for the bank and manhandle their canoes to the next safe stretch of the river. Roosevelt and his men did succeed in their mission, and the Brazilians renamed the river Rio Roosevelt in his honor. Yet their inability to anticipate what lay ahead had made their task very much harder than it might have been. Little over a decade later, however, other expeditions were exploring the region, but they had a new aid: the aeroplane. Now they could reconnoiter ahead and work out how to overcome obstacles before they came to them. planes could also keep expeditions supplied and evacuate sick and injured. Thanks to the aircraft, the complex system of rivers and tributaries which make up the Amazon basin could finally be established and accurately mapped. The aircraft had indeed transformed the unknown to the known. It was the same in Australia. During the 19th century, a number of expeditions set out to explore the vast hinterland that makes up so much of the subcontinent, the outback. Many perished, and others endured indescribable suffering. During the decade of the 1920s, the aircraft came to the outback. Now regions which had taken months and sometimes years to survey could be thoroughly explored in days or weeks. Furthermore, by the 1930s, commercial air routes into and over the outback had become firmly established. Moving north from Australia, the mountainous jungles of Papua New Guinea were even more inaccessible than the outback. In 1926, gold was discovered here. But to reach the site required a stiff 10-day trek through the jungle, with the ever-present dangers of fever, disease, and cannibals. The following year, an airline was set up and carried passengers and supplies from Leh to the inland strip at Wau in just 3 hours. In 1930, thanks to the German Junkers G-31 transport, the company was able to deliver the entire dredging and hydraulic equipment needed to develop the goldfields still further. Thus, Papua New Guinea began to be opened up. The fighting here during the Second World War further added to knowledge of the interior, not least thanks to air resupply. But not until after 1945 did this remote area really reveal its secrets, again largely thanks to the aircraft. More dramatic, however, has been the part played by the aircraft in polar exploration. From the 17th century onwards, Arctic exploration concentrated on finding the Northwest Passage, which runs from the Atlantic north of Canada and into the Pacific. It was believed this would dramatically cut the sailing time from Europe to the fabulous wealth of the Orient. But not until the mid-19th century was its existence finally established, and explorers then turned to the North Pole itself. First to try to reach it was American naval officer George Washington DeLong in 1879. He and most of his companions perished after their ship was crushed in the ice. Young Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen also tried during the early 1890s, but was beaten back by the conditions. Then, in 1897, Swedish engineer Salomon André tried to overfly the North Pole in a hot air balloon. With two companions, he lifted off from the island of Spitsbergen, north of Norway, on the 11th of July of that year. Nothing more was seen or heard of them. Not until 1930 was the fate of André and his companions established, when a Norwegian expedition came across the remains of the three men on Whale Island, 300 miles from Spitsbergen. Their balloon had been pierced by ice shards, and they'd been forced to descend. André and his companions had survived for 14 weeks in this desolate place before succumbing to the elements. The balloon became their tombstone. Not for another decade were further attempts made to reach the North Pole, and then it was on foot. Two Americans, Dr. Frederick Cook and Admiral Robert E. Peary, both claimed to have reached it, and bitter recrimination between the two resulted. In the end, most people believed Peary rather than his rival, although neither claim was officially ratified. The 1920s, however, witnessed some dramatic examples of the use of flight to explore the Arctic. In 1924, Briton George Binney and American naval officer Richard E. Byrd made the first Arctic aircraft flights. The following year came a more ambitious project. Norwegian Roald Amundsen was, without doubt, the foremost polar explorer of his day, having in 1911 led the first expedition to reach the South Pole. He and American multimillionaire explorer Lincoln Ellsworth hatched a plan to fly two German-built Dornier Val flying boats to the North Pole. They took off, each with two crew members in two Vals, on the 21st of May 1925. They soon ran into fog and lost their way. After 8 hours flying, they were forced to put down on a floe 150 miles short of their objective. But in so doing, one of the Vals was seriously damaged. For the next 4 weeks, while the world waited for news, Amundsen, Ellsworth and their crewmen struggled to construct a suitable runway on the rough ice so that the remaining Val could take off. This achieved, they transferred fuel from the damaged plane and prepared for takeoff. They successfully lifted off the ice, but their troubles were not at an end. They were forced down onto the sea and had to be towed into Spitsbergen by a whaling ship. They'd all stood up remarkably well to their ordeal. That same summer of 1925, Commander Byrd led two lowing amphibians in the first flight over the Canadian Arctic. The following year, Byrd set his sights on achieving what Amundsen had failed to do, the overflight of the North Pole. He used a Fokker F-7, named after the daughter of one of his sponsors, Edsel Ford, of the automobile manufacturing company. With Floyd Bennett as his pilot, Byrd took off on the 9th of May, 1926. The 1,500-mile flight took them 16 hours, but during the course of it, they circled the North Pole and landed triumphant back at their base camp. Bird later described his sensations overflying the Arctic.
It was with a feeling of exhilaration that we felt that for the first time in history, two mites of men could gaze upon its charms and discover its secrets out of reach of those sharp claws.
But Roald Amundsen was also to make another attempt within just a few days of this, but in an airship. The Noria was the creation of Italian General Umberto Nobile. The Italian government agreed to loan the airship to Amundsen for his attempt, with Nobile and an Italian crew being provided to man it. Accompanied once more by Lincoln Ellsworth, Amundsen and Nobile set off from Spitsbergen on the 11th of May 1926. The Norge, which the Eskimos called a great white whale, overflew the pole and went on across the Arctic. 72 hours after setting out, the airship came to rest at Teller, Alaska, having flown 3,000 miles. Unfortunately, its envelope was seriously damaged, probably by ice shards flying off the propellers, and it never flew again. It was Nobile who was seen by the media as the hero of this flight. This embittered Amundsen. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was so impressed that he commissioned Nobile to undertake another polar flight. This took place in May 1928 in a new airship, Italia. Nobile again reached the North Pole, dropping a crucifix given to him by the Pope as he flew over it. But now the airship was confronted by fierce headwinds. It also began to ice up and became impossible to control. Next thing the crew knew was that the Italia had crashed into an ice cap some 180 miles from Spitsbergen. Luckily, the survivors had provisions and a radio, which was used to summon help. Several ships and aircraft took part in the search. The searchers included Roald Amundsen, who, forgetting his animosity towards Nobile, was lent a French seaplane and its crew. Tragically, they vanished without trace. Eventually, 30 days after the crash, a Swedish light aircraft located the airship, but the pilot had orders to rescue only Nobile. Not for another 2 months did a Russian icebreaker take off the other survivors. On his return to Italy, Nobile was found guilty of dereliction of duty and was forced to emigrate. Only after the Second World War was he able to clear his name in his native country. In the meantime, another explorer-aviator had been surveying the Arctic. This was Australian Hubert Wilkins, who had been a combat pilot decorated for bravery during the Great War. Prior to this, he had spent much time exploring the Canadian Arctic and believed that polar meteorological stations could provide more accurate weather forecasting. In 1926, with American co-pilot Carl Eielson, Wilkins began survey flights from Point Barrow, Alaska, 700 miles from the North Pole. After a number of forced landings and other mishaps, they culminated in an epic flight in April 1928. Wilkins and Eielson flew a Lockheed Vega some 2,000 miles from Point Barrow to Spitsbergen. It was the first aircraft flight across the Arctic, and finally established beyond doubt that the region was a large ice cap containing no land. During the 1930s, several different nations mounted further expeditions to the Arctic regions. The Arctic also played its part during the Second World War, notably in the Allied convoys delivering war material to North Russian ports. As for Arctic aviation feats, 1951 saw the first solo flight over the North Pole by American Captain Charles Blair, who took off from Bardufoss in Norway in a P-51 Mustang. The following year, a Douglas C-47 transport became the first aircraft to land at the pole. In the years since the 1950s, there have been numerous expeditions to the Arctic. In all of them, the aircraft has played a key part in keeping them resupplied. One of the most notable of these was that by Briton Wally Herbert and 3 companions. They planned to cross the Arctic Sea via the North Pole on foot. Using dog teams, they set out from Point Barrow on their epic journey in February 1968. They overcame numerous obstacles en route. In April of the following year, they reached the North Pole. Then they pushed on towards Spitsbergen. They arrived at the other side of the Arctic ice cap at the end of May 1969. But none of this would have been possible without the support of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Using C-130 transports, monthly supply drops were made to Wally Herbert's expedition. These were literally manna from heaven and kept the team members and their dogs sustained. It was perhaps symbolic, too, that Royal Navy helicopters should lift the team and their dogs off the ice to take them aboard the survey ship HMS Endurance. This was to take them home to Britain. But it was the epic survey flights of the 1920s which had really begun to open up the Arctic. The same would happen at the other end of the world during the 1930s, with many of the veteran Arctic aviators playing a key part in opening up the Antarctic. Unlike the Arctic, the Antarctic is a frozen landmass. This has enabled permanent bases to be set up there. Partly because of this, the subcontinent has attracted more public interest than its northern rival. But the early years of Antarctic exploration also provided more stirring epic stories. None is more gripping or poignant than the race between Norwegian Roald Amundsen and Briton Captain Robert Scott to be the first to the South Pole. Amundsen, who used dogs, won. He reached the pole on the 16th of December 1911. Scott and his team dragged their sledges on foot. They arrived at the South Pole a month later to find a message of commiseration from Amundsen. There was, too, a Norwegian flag proudly flying at the masthead. Then came Scott's desperate return journey. He and his men grew ever weaker as they struggled over glaciers and other obstacles. The weather worsened, confining them to their tent, where one after another they succumbed. That same year, 1912, New Zealander Douglas Mawson survived a solo trek of 100 miles after his two companions died. He then had to wait nearly a year at his base camp before rescue. Shortly afterwards came another epic involving Briton Ernest Shackleton and his 1914 expedition. They saw their ship crushed by the ice and were left stranded on a floe. Undeterred by their misfortune, they set off in boats to make for land. Having left the bulk of his party on a desolate island, Shackleton and a few others set off to seek help from the whaling station at South Georgia. They eventually made it, and after several more adventures, the whole expedition was rescued without the loss of a single man. These epics gave Antarctica a sinister mystique that the North Pole never quite had. Nevertheless, the use of aircraft to help exploration began a little later than in the Arctic. It was Australian Hubert Wilkins, he who'd carried out the first trans-Arctic aircraft flight in 1928, who pioneered Antarctic aerial exploration. No sooner had he achieved his Arctic feat than he transferred his attention to the bottom of the world. Wilkins brought a Lockheed Vega aircraft with him to Antarctica. With this, he carried out the first survey flights of the subcontinent. This helped to put some of Antarctica's major landmarks on the map. American naval officer Commander Richard Byrd the first to overfly the North Pole, now stepped onto the scene. He set up a base called Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf, very close to where Amundsen's base camp for his triumphant 1911 trek to the South Pole had been. Byrd was determined to be the first to overfly the South Pole, and prepared to do so in a Ford trimotor. To protect the aircraft from the elements, the expedition built an igloo hangar. Byrd plotted his course with care. Once the weather improved, the Ford trimotor was disinterred and prepared for the flight. In spite of being entombed in the ice, the engine started with little trouble. On the 29th of November, 1929, Byrd finally took off. But the aircraft first had to get over the ice cliffs of the Queen Maud Range. On board the noisy aircraft, an ingenious communication system had been devised. In the end, the crew were forced to jettison their survival kits to enable the aircraft to gain sufficient altitude to clear the barrier. Byrd went on to become the first person to overfly both poles. He returned to Antarctica in 1934, but came close to death from carbon monoxide while isolated in a weather station. Only the alertness of radio operators at his base camp enabled him to be rescued in time. The main emphasis of exploration in Antarctica during the 1930s was on mapping as yet unexplored parts. One who played a leading part in this was another veteran Arctic aviator, Lincoln Ellsworth. In one of the earliest on-the-spot interviews, Ellsworth explained his motivation. He saw the Antarctic as one of the last, largely undiscovered regions of the world, and with exploration in his blood, it was a must.
My interest is to fly across this continent from the Ross Sea on one side to the Weddell Sea on the other side. These two great seas form two great indentations which cut into the land. Whether or not they join is the object of my exploration. The flight is 1,400 miles across, and as we cannot come down on the Weddell Sea side on account of weather conditions, why, we will have to turn around and retrace our steps, which makes a total flight of 2,900 miles.
Ellsworth and his co-pilot, Rollick Kenyon, set off on this flight towards the end of 1935 in a Lockheed Gamma. It proved to be a remarkably trouble-free flight, both on the outward and inward legs. Lincoln Ellsworth later described how they felt after this great achievement.
At such moments in the storybooks, men are supposed to make memorable remarks, but in actual life, behavior seems to be different. What happened was this. As soon as the open water appeared in the north, Rollick Kenyon turned round and looked at me. I expected him to say something, but he did not. Nor could I think of anything to say. I stared back at him. Then we resumed our individual tasks. After all, what was there to say?
The following year, 1936, Ellsworth and Kenyon faced catastrophe when they had to make a forced landing. A massive air-sea search operation was mounted, and for weeks there was no news of them. However, they managed to make their way to Byrd's deserted base camp, Little America. An aircraft eventually spotted them. A rescue party set out and returned Ellsworth and Kenyon to civilization. Their adventure highlighted only too clearly the hazards of polar flight. On the eve of the Second World War, Byrd led his third Antarctic expedition, which lasted for 2 years. During it, he carried out more aerial surveys, as well as expeditions on the ground. Then, after the war was over, Byrd returned to Antarctica once more, this time with the largest expedition ever sent there. Named Operation High Jump, it consisted of over 4,000 men, 13 ships, and 20 aircraft, including helicopters. During the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, the Americans established a permanent base camp at the South Pole. Admiral George Dufek, who was in charge of the operation, became the first person to visit it by air. Just over a decade later, in November 1969, the aircraft enabled another polar first to be achieved. This was a visit by 6 women, all Americans, to the South Pole. It was certainly an experience that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Nowadays, the aircraft plays a crucial role in Antarctica. Not only is it the main means of maintaining supplies to the numerous bases now established there, but it also supports the expeditions that continue to face the severe challenges of the region. This has been especially so in recent years, when explorers and adventurers have repeatedly struggled to overcome the subcontinent's last remaining major hurdle, the crossing of Antarctica on foot. But it was the years 1925 to 39 which were undoubtedly the golden age of aerial exploration. And one other dramatic example of this took place in another of the world's remote regions in 1933. Everest, the world's highest mountain, stands close to the border between Tibet and Nepal. Its conquest has long been the ambition of many of the world's leading climbers. The first attempts to climb it were made by the British during the 1920s. No one, however, knew exactly what the summit would look like. The idea therefore evolved of filming Everest from the air. A wealthy British philanthropist, Lady Houston, whose money had already ensured Britain's winning of the 1931 Schneider Trophy competition for seaplanes, agreed to sponsor the attempt. 2 Westland PV-3s were to be used.
Well, I think that's about the best we're likely to get. How's the visibility? 17,000 is a haze and no clouds. You prepared to go, Clydesdale?
I am indeed.
And you, McIntyre?
Rather, let's get on with it. Well, come on, let's get our test first and start. Right, I'll go and get the engine machine dog.
The crews needed oxygen equipment, then still in its infancy.
About this business of the heating and the oxygen, if anything goes wrong, it's absolutely your discretion, and there's no good being heroic. The only thing is for you to tell the pilot definitely to go back. Anything goes wrong with either of them. Lock on full.
Quite okay, George. Put them in.
Righto, just coming. Where's opening? Here we are.
The heat at this airfield in what was then northern India on the morning of the 3rd of April 1933 was in stark contrast to the conditions that the crews would soon face. Now came the moment of truth. Soon they were over the foothills of the Himalayas. One of the crew members takes up the story.
We were in a tremendous downrush of air. Though the machine continued to climb, it was climbing in an air current that was carrying it down at a much greater velocity. 2,000 feet were lost before the downrush cushioned itself out on the glacier beds. We were in a most serious position. The great bulk of Everest was towering above us on the left, Makalu downwind on the right, and the connecting range dead ahead, with a hurricane wind doing its best to carry us over and dash us on the knife-edge sides of Makalu.
Nevertheless, they managed to regain altitude. Now they were seeing sights that no man had witnessed before. There was Everest in all its majesty, and the news cameraman on board had the scoop of a lifetime. But then, near disaster. He'd broken his oxygen tube. Only quick thinking saved him. Such was the cameraman's coolness that he carried on filming. Now the crews were able to view Everest in detail. it was a strange sensation looking down on the world's highest point. Indeed, it was hard to drag themselves away. Back at the airfield, people were anxiously waiting, but a radio message stated that the Westlands were approaching. And so they returned after what had been a unique flight, whose record would thrill cinema audiences all round the world. Even so, Everest would continue to resist attempts to conquer it. Not for another 20 years would a human being finally stand on the summit. Today, when almost everywhere in the world can be reached by aircraft, the scope for true exploration has become ever more limited. Yet aviation still has a valuable role to play in aerial survey. True, satellites now do much of the monitoring, from watching weather patterns to surveying for oil reserves. Indeed, satellites are enabling us to rapidly understand more about the planet we live on. Yet aircraft still make a significant contribution. They include types like this former Lockheed U-2 spy plane. One activity is in monitoring global pollution. This is especially in the effects it is having on the ozone layer, notably that over Antarctica. Here it is constantly measured by aircraft. Analysis of the data enables scientists to establish the precise rate at which the ozone layer is thinning. Another aviation role is in monitoring volcanoes. In the spring of 1997, one underneath a glacier in Iceland threatened to erupt, with untold consequences to the island. Sending up observers in an aircraft proved to be the only way in which the volcano could be watched. Luckily, it did not erupt. But during the last third of this century, a new form of aerial exploration has been taking place.
1, 0, and liftoff! Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Humanity has literally been reaching out to the stars.
3 engines at 104%.
Given the infinity that is space, this is an adventure that is likely to be endless.